Over 750,000 games have been created with Unity, so clearly it is still a popular choice amongst developers. Games such as Fall Guys, Among Us, Hearthstone, just to name a few, are games that have been completed with Unity Engine. So I assume you're here either because you're thinking about using Unity or you've chosen to use Unity. Either way, that's exciting. Choosing the game engine's a big step. You're well on your way to starting your game. But how do you start? Do you have any experience? I sure didn't when I started my first game, Maze Changer. When I started with Unity, I found a tutorial on the Unity website. It was a game with a ball that collected pellets. You may have seen that tutorial. Well, I did learn from it, and it did help me start my journey. It didn't really prepare me for creating my first game, Maze Changer. When searching for tutorials for beginners in Unity, I find that they fall into two different categories. On the one hand, we've got the tutorials that are really just about creating your own new game. It's more strategies and concepts, perhaps game design documents, but nothing about the engine itself and how to make something in it. And then on the other hand, we have the tutorials that are perhaps hours long, or there's multiple videos in a playlist, or that you're watching people code for a long time. I'm going to try to be right down the middle for this. Firstly, today, I'm going to show you the asset store and why it's okay to use it. Second, we're going to create a level using assets, a real level. We're going to create a player, have the player move around your level. And then lastly, I want to show you that if you know those first three steps, that's the building blocks for continuing your game development. You'll have everything you need. Let's get started. The Unity Asset Store. Very simply, we can get to it through our window menu and click Asset Store. The Asset Store is incredibly powerful. It has everything that you could possibly need for your game, no matter if it's your first or your 100th. The asset that I'm going to use, that I've been using for my current game, is called Village Interiors. It's right here. This is the one we'll highlight today. Notice it's on sale too. One of the things with the asset store, just keep an eye. There are a lot of great sales. However, all you need to do, click whether you want 2D or 3D, click environments, and you're going to get a whole bunch of results with environments that you could start with. If you're just starting out, perhaps $80 or even $27.50 looks a little bit daunting. There are assets that are free. Very often they're not quite as good as what you could get, but they still work and they're great to start. For your first game, I'd recommend an interior as opposed to an exterior environment. That way you don't have to worry about what happens if the player runs too far. You can just put a wall up where you want them to stop. But ultimately you can choose what you would like. Okay, we've been to the Unity store. We've selected a package. We're going to create an interior room for our first game level. There are 5 steps needed to create these levels, and if we remember these, they become very, very simple. Step 1 is the floor, followed by some walls, then make a roof, create the lighting that you want, and add decorations. So let's start with step 1, floors. In your asset package, there should be some prefabs that would be created by the person that made your package. Find what you're looking for. I'm going to use this particular prefab for me and put it in place on here. And I'm just going to center it around the zeros just for ease of use. I'm also going to create an empty object in our tree called floors, and this is just for organization. Once you have that, and we'll notice that it kind of didn't keep the zero, so we'll just zero it out again. Once we have that, we can duplicate one of these assets in the tree. We can use arrows to drag, or if you know the size of your assets, we can use the coordinates up in the transform, like so, to move them around. Step 2, we want walls. Create another empty object, call it walls, And in my case, we have these things separated for us as well. And we want to select the walls that we want. And then once we have what we want, we can duplicate again. And once again, we can drag, or again, if you know the numbers, we can just plop them in and keep going around. Okay, step 3 is the roof. Now, your asset package may have specific roof pieces, or you could even use the same object as what we have used for the floor, and that's what I'm going to use. So we've got a copy of our floor here. We want to move it up. It's now at the top, but we can see through it. This is a one-way asset, so we flip it around, and then we've got a roof. So once again, we just duplicate and start moving it around. All right, we've got our enclosed room. Step 4, lighting. Now, we've got a pretty bright ambient light here, which is fine. A lot of asset packages also come with some sort of lighting that fits with your interior. I'm in sort of a medieval castle type of thing, so there is a lot with torches and candles, so I'm going to use some of that. Step 5 is decorations. This is where your creativity comes in. Make this room what you want in your game level. This is where you get to make it your own. This also depends on your asset package. Mine is very much that medieval type of scene, so I can put in a bar. And I can put in stools. I can put in some wine racks. I can put in some shelving that will go against the wall. On those shelves, perhaps some bottles. Or perhaps even some glassware. As I said, this is where you get to shine. Your creativity shines through. This is just the beginnings and the basics, but once you have something like this, we can easily, with time, transform it into something like this. A lot of asset packages will have demo scenes already built in. Use them, check them out. This is the asset package creator using demo scenes to show off their stuff, so they're usually pretty good. When you're looking at them, use them for ideas. What is possible? What could be done with the package? And if it's good enough and it fits your game, maybe you can use it as the base for one of your levels. Now back in our simple room here, what are we missing? Well, we need to be able to get around this, which means we need a player. Now there's two options for your player. The first one is we can create one on our own, which is what we'll do here. Or once again, you can use the asset store. If we do a search for our first person controller, we get a number of options. We've got to start getting third person controller as well. So you can use the Unity Asset Store to pick a first person controller if you choose, or you can, as we're going to do today, create one on your own. So let's start doing that. The first thing that we need is a player. And what we're going to do is right click, hit 3D object and use a capsule. We will then center that at the 0, 0, 0 just so we can see it. There it is. We'll bring it up a bit, maybe bring it a bit closer to us. Once again, you can control this yourself. If you want the player to be not as wide, we can switch these to 0.5s if you want them to be a little taller. This is all about what you want for your game. Okay, so now that we've got the capsule that's going to represent the player, we need a couple more things. We're going to add an empty object underneath it, and we're going to call it player head. And that reminds me, we have to rename the capsule to player. And then we want to move our main camera down to the player head. That will focus. We actually want to change this to 0, 0, 0. So that focuses the camera on the player's head. The only last thing that we want to do is move the player head up near the top, just kind of to represent that the camera is up in the player's head instead of its middle of the body. We have our player, the player head and the camera, and we can see that the camera is focused in on our level here now. So the next step is to get this player moving around. So there's a few things that we got to do to set this up. We need to add a rigid body to our player. In this rigid body, I'm just going to change the mass. These are settings that you can play with, but for the purpose of the tutorial, we'll just set the mass to 70. And we're going to freeze rotation on the X, the Y, and the Z axis. The next thing that we need after we save is a first person controller. So we're going to create a script. We are going to create a C# script, in fact. We will call it first person controller. Okay, as you can see on the right, we've got our start and update functions. So let's go into Visual Studio and create the code that we need. So just as we saw in Unity, we've got a start and an update function. We actually don't need the start function in this example, so we're going to remove that. I'm also going to remove the comment as it's pretty unnecessary. You'll get to know exactly what that does with all of the controllers and code you'll write. And I'm going to remove the using statement because those are not being used right now. So the first thing we're going to need are some parameters at the top of the class that we can pass our objects from Unity back into the code. So we're going to use what's called a serialized field so that we can see that in the Unity engine. And our first one is going to be a rigid body, and it's going to be called player rigid body. The second thing, another serialized field. This one is going to be, instead of a rigid body, it'll be a transform. Now we are missing some private declarations here. So we're going to put those in. And we're going to call this one player head. We are going to create a private, we use a serialized field again. we are going to call it private, this time a float for player speed. And then one more, not player health, we're going to call it player rotation speed. We can set defaults for these floats. I'm going to do that. 2.0F. F in code denotes float. And for this rotation, we'll go 3.0F as well. Okay. Now, we've got an update function. We're going to add first a private declaration at the beginning of that. And we're also going to do a private void fixed update as well. There's documentation on the difference between these two. There's also a late update, which we won't use today. Very, very simply, update runs once per frame. Fixed update isn't necessarily run once per frame. You use fixed update when you're applying physics. You use update when you need something to go every frame. We're going to use the fixed update today to apply the physics to move our character. So we're going to go vector 3, new velocity. Is equal to vector 3.up times player rigid body dot velocity dot y. Now I'm very quickly going to write this code out, and then we'll go back and explain exactly what it does. New velocity dot x is equal to input dot get axis. You want the horizontal axis, and we're going to multiply that by the player speed. Oops. And then similarly for the z-axis, input dot get axis and vertical times underscore player speed. Then lastly, we need to set the rigid body, player dot rigid body dot velocity is equal to transform dot transform direction, the new velocity. Okay, as promised, we'll quickly go over this. This is all of the code to get us to move, at least moving the character. It doesn't handle rotation. Our vector 3 is a way that we can store our velocity, and it's used in a lot of other methods, but for today it's storing our velocity. And we're using vector 3.up, and if we hover over that, we can see that it's a vector 3 of 0, 1, 0. So this is allowing us to zero out the x and the z parameters of our variable. And then we are using the rigid body's velocity at y. So basically we're taking the y parameter of our rigid body as it is right now and using it in the new one. That's what that line does. The next line and the one after that, we get the horizontal axis of our keyboard entry and multiplied by the player speed. And same thing with the vertical. So this is the WASD inputs, and we're putting that into the x and z parameters of our new velocity. Then we are, this is not correct here. This is the velocity is equal to transform direction new velocity. This line, the transform direction, takes the coordinates out of our local space into the world space. What that means is local space is relative to the objects that it's parent to. World space is relative to the center of the world. So we're using the world space to move our player. So this is all the code we need to move our player. Let's get back into Unity. There's a couple more settings to add. Back into Unity, we select our player. We add a component. We call it, it's already been called first person controller. It'll be in the list if you have no errors. We then add it there. We get access to our rigid body, our head, our speed, and our rotation speed. So in our player rigid body, we want to take the player object from our tree and drag it in over here like this. And it'll specify this rigid body right here. And then the other one is the player head. So again, we grab the player head and we drag it into here. Our player speed, our player rotation speed, they are here. We can change them here as well, and it'll overwrite what's in the code. But we'll leave the 2 and 3 for now. That should be it. We'll now try our code. And with that, we're able to move around. We can't rotate yet, but we are able to move around. Great, let's handle the rotation. Okay, back in Visual Studio, we're going to use the update function to do our rotation for our player. And we are also going to use our right mouse button to do rotation. This is very similar to games like Roblox. There are, of course, a number of different ways that you can do rotation, but today, just for simplicity, we'll use the right mouse button. In order to do that, we have a conditional if input dot get mouse button, and it's mouse button number 1. Mouse button 0 is the left mouse button 1 the right, and mouse button 2 the middle. Then we can handle our horizontal rotation. Transform dot rotate. Nope. And we pass in our player rotation speed times by our input dot get axis. This time we're going to want the mouse X parameter. And we multiply that, multiply that by vector 3.up. A reminder that vector 3.up just zeroes out our parameters for the X and the Z coordinates. Okay, let's handle the vertical rotation. This time we don't want to rotate our player because that'll screw up some of the movement and have weird angles. Instead, we want to rotate the player's head. So we already have a parameter for that we created at the beginning. We want the player head dot rotate, and that function's on there because it is already a transform. And we are going to pass in the player rotation speed. We're going to multiply by the input dot get axis, but the mouse Y direction this time. And, and to multiply by vector 3 dot left. Okay, the dot left similar to up in that it's zeroing out the Y and the Z axis, and for the X it's multiplying by -1. This is just to make sure we get the right rotation. We'll save that. Okay, back in Unity, all we need to do is play the game to test out our code. So our movement is still good with the WASD, and we can now use the mouse, hold the right button down and look left, look right, up, down, or any combination. So already we've got a functioning player moving around. If we try to walk into this bar, look at that, we've got some physics already working. It doesn't let me do that. What's interesting though, we can walk through these stools. So the last thing I'll show in here is just how to prevent that. So if we select these stools that we've added as decorations, there's two things that we want to add. We want to add a box collider. So this will allow us to collide in to the stools. And then we want to add a rigid body. Now for this first stool, I'm going to leave his kinematic off. This will allow our player to interact with the stool. It'll knock it over, it'll move it. And for the second stool, we'll add a box collider and a rigid body. But we'll put is kinematic on, which means that we'll hit it, but it won't move. Let's just test it out so that you can see a visual cue for that. So again, this first one, we should run into it and knock it over. There we go. And the second one, we run into it, but it stops us. It doesn't knock over. That's the difference for the is kinematic. So we have a level, we have a player, and our player can move. Well, what's next? My recommendation to you is to focus on your strength. If your strength is coding like me, well then, learn about the classes and the functions that Unity provides. There's a lot of power in those classes that will make your game unique. If your strength is creating assets in Blender or Photoshop, or other applications for that matter, well, first of all, I wish I had your skill. Second of all, focus on those skills. You can make a great, unique game with your own assets. For the music composers out there, same thing. Go compose your music. The important part is focus on your strength. It will make your game shine. For everything else, there's the asset store. You hear about game developers taking years and years and years to make your games. You can immensely cut that down by using the asset store. I've seen tutorials and videos from game developers online that say this. If they could go back and change one thing, the one thing that they would change is to use what other people have made and focus on their strengths. Do that for you. You'll save time, your games will come out earlier, and they will shine because you are using your strength. Well, there you have it. That's it from me today. Thanks for joining. Of course, this is just the beginning for you. What we built today, it's not a game, but it could be the beginning one if you want. And if it doesn't fit your game, well, then scrap it and create something similar that is part of your game. The important thing is that the engine isn't blocking you anymore. You've been into Unity, you've used the asset store, you created a level with those assets. You've got a player in that level, that player moves around, and you've made code that makes that player move around. You don't need much more than that. Sure, there are concepts that you don't know, but when you use ChatGPT, Edge's Copilot, or other search or other tutorials, you'll find that it's a combination of the skills we use today to get those things to work as well. If you're wanting any other tutorials for Unity, you could subscribe. I'm going to be putting more out. I will link to one up here. Otherwise, thanks again for joining. We'll chat soon. And leave a comment. If you have any games that you put out anytime in the future, just find one of my videos, leave a comment. I'd love to check them out. We'll chat soon. Thanks.